Today on The Journey, from Steve DeWitt.
Real manhood through the eyes of God is about character, okay? It's about character. It's not your bicep. It's not your truck. It's not your gun. It's your character that defines who is a real man and who is not. The mission for a man is to devote our lives to make disciples of Jesus.
What does true masculinity look like in today's changing world? Today on The Journey, Pastor Steve DeWitt brings us to the Word of God to reveal His timeless design for authentic manhood. Beyond cultural stereotypes and shifting definitions, we'll explore how real masculine strength expresses itself through Christ-like servant leadership and protective love. It's a message titled, What is a Man? And later after the message, we'll tell you about a timely and helpful resource available online at thejourney.fm. But now here's Pastor Steve DeWitt to get us started.
Now you might be thinking to yourself, what is a man? This would seem to be a self-evident sort of question. You know, you can look at the body plumbing and you can look at the DNA and you can say this is a boy and this is a girl. End of sermon, let's go home. But it's not that easy. And it certainly is not that easy anymore, not in the day that we live in, because we live in a day where increasingly the ancient Christian definition of these terms, family, woman, man, husband, wife, are being jettisoned in the desire to create a new kind of humanity and a new kind of society. In fact, the gravity of our society is increasingly away from a tether between biological gender birth and the living out of that gender into adulthood. One very prominent example of this is Facebook, which in the past listed 56 different gender choices that you could pick from in your profile. One that they currently have, one option, is a custom box. In other words, create your own and identify in whatever way that you want to identify. And I think that custom box, in more than anything, summarizes the Western civilization's approach to this in the day that we live in, where we are allowed to make it whatever we want. It's the Build-A-Bear approach to identity and gender, which appears to be the greatest path of freedom. And our society increasingly is desiring to get off the road that God in His divine revelation gave to us in pursuing a kind of freedom. But in the end, this freedom is really a wreck. Adding to this, of course, is the tragedy that God's plan for genders, two, male, female, is excellent and beautiful. Even Jesus, when He was speaking about marriage and divorce, goes back to God's original design. Here's what He said in Matthew 19. He answered, "Have you not read that He who created them from the beginning made them male and female?" And if I might also note, Jesus, born a boy, born a male, lived out male masculinity his entire life better than any. So his whole argument there is rooted in God's original design for humanity, an original design for gender. Male and female, He created them. And this is God's good, perfect plan. This is where He stepped back and said, this is very good. And so male and female, by God's intent and purpose and opinion, is a beautiful and a wonderful thing. Your maleness is a beautiful and wonderful thing. Your femaleness is a beautiful and wonderful thing in the eyes of God. Society sees these things as increasingly optional, but God engineered these before the beginning of time, and He purposed two genders, male and female. He created them. So with that said, let's address our question today. What is a man? Men, how would you answer that? And I can imagine some of you going, well, I mean, isn't it kind of sort of plainly obvious what a man is? I would say, no, it's not. In fact, if you had a 10-year-old son and he said to you, Daddy, what is a man? Do you realize in asking that question, he is asking, who am I? And what am I to become? What does it mean to be a man? Further, there is a vast difference between man and male, okay? Male is about body plumbing and DNA. But a real man has nothing to do with these sorts of things. A real man has nothing to do with not playing the flute. So let's get the stereotypes out of our mind, and here is my best attempt at a definition of what is a man. And we're gonna walk through this definition, but here it is. A man is a biological male, human, who embraces God's design for male headship, servant leadership, and sexual fidelity and protection of women. So let's walk through it. Here we go. We begin with a man is a biological male. And there's so many examples of this in our current culture. I read the news this morning that two female identifying males that swam against each other and one beat the other and they dominated all the other female born swimmers. And why does it make headlines? It makes headlines for this point that we're making here. And the church and God's people have to say, no, manhood and maleness is tethered to biological birth, what your gender is when you are born, what your DNA is. Is there a Y chromosome or not? Because we look at that and we see God's intent for the person. We can change our clothes, but we cannot change our DNA by God's design. Who embraces God's design for male headship. Now, headship, I'm acknowledging this is a term not often used. It is a Bible term. It's an old term, but it is a Bible term. It is a biblical concept. One example of this, 1 Corinthians 11:3. But I want you to understand that the head of every man is Christ. The head of a wife not woman, wife is her husband, and the head of Christ is God. Headship. Failures in headship include male passivity and male abdication of leadership within marriage and within the church and other contexts. So headship here is a term of strength. It is a term describing care and love and stewardship and sacrifice. The Bible gives equal value to both genders. Male and female, he created them. There is equal value. The women aren't more valuable than the men aren't more valuable than the women in the eyes of God. But within that equality of worth and value, we find also by God's design an engineering of different roles in some respects. Unique callings for both of the genders. Men are called to a kind of leadership and headship. When men are passive, families and society breaks down. This is true and could be established down through history. Whereas masculine strength, and when men are masculine men, it actually creates a context for the women to be feminine women. Or to say it this way, when men are masculine, women become even more beautifully feminine because it creates a context of safety and protection. And that feminine beauty, which is so amazingly beautiful and wonderful, is also fragile. And men create the context where women can be women. So by God's design, here's the point. These go together. They complement each other. And as each does its part well, together, they are better than apart. Male headship, which expresses itself largely in the next point. Servant leadership. What does it mean to be a man? Servant leadership. Like Jesus, men are called to serve their families, to serve their community, indeed even to serve their country, and to do so in a kind of, this is what masculine strength looks like. So when masculinity becomes weak, Now it seeks to dominate and to exploit women. In some ways, that in there's a strange way of thinking, so a man who's doing that, he's so manly, No, that's weakness. And we got to train our minds to realize that is male weakness that exploits women. Masculine strength protects women and provides for women and families and seeks to serve them. And when that service is happening in a marriage or a family, church, here comes God's blessing and God's shalom, God's flourishing comes to that home and to that church. Servant leadership. And men, listen, this is a tough thing. We got to get this in our brain, but this is, I would say, absolutely essential to what it means to be a man, is to be a servant, to lead from a position like Jesus of washing the feet. Who was the greatest man who ever lived other than John the Baptist? I'll get to that in a moment. It was, of course, Jesus. And what did Jesus say? Even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. This is our calling. And if I could just ask men, how are you doing with strong, masculine servant leadership? So critical. We're going to keep going here. Got a lot to say today. Sexual fidelity. Masculinity, real men are committed to sexual fidelity. God calls men to protect not only their own virtue, but the virtue of women. And by doing this, it actually enhances and channels sexual pleasure and desire within marriage. Now, this is counterintuitive, but I recently wrote an article that highlighted one of our counseling challenges here in our church, and I'm going to speak frankly, is men who struggle with arousal for their wife. And you say, well, how could this be? Because a lifestyle of pornography has so affected their perspective, they think it enhances sexuality, but it actually diminishes it. Think of that. It diminishes it. The fake steals from the real. And we have a whole generation now, and with so much pornography, and it's everywhere, that of men who are unwittingly emasculating themselves. I mean, think of this. In World War II, many of you know I love World War II. I've read tons of World War II. Other than dying, soldiers in World War II, their greatest fear was a wound in their manhood. But yet today, we have men who are boys and men who are not intentionally, I say unwittingly, in a sense, castrating themselves, demasculating themselves, diminishing their capacity to enjoy this sexual gift from God in marriage. And I wonder if we could look at it this way and to realize that every pornographic look steals a little joy and a little satisfaction in the present or maybe the future marital bed. You are training your mind and your soul and your sexual being to look and to view and to objectify women in a particular way. You are damaging your future marital bed. And how many men, if we actually looked at it that way, would ever want to do that? And finally, men, real men, give themselves for the protection of women. What this means is that there is a kind of masculinity that recognizes responsibility for the care of their wife and their children if they're married. And this maybe is intuitive to us. If there is a bump in the night, there's a sound in the house, who gets up and goes and checks that out? I would say it ought to be the man. Now, if you're married to the warrior princess, perhaps you paper, scissors, stones on who has to go do it. But in general, a man who wants to protect his family is getting up and he's going and he's checking it out. That's what real men do. Think about those last minutes on the Titanic as the lifeboats were filling with women and children largely. What does that tell us about who was on board the Titanic? that tells us there were some real men on board on the Titanic. Real men do that. Real men do not exploit women. Real men do not pimp women. Real men do not traffic women. Real men honor girls, daughters, women, and wives. So, that's my definition of a man. Walk through it briefly with you. What does that look like in life then? How does that play out in the categories of life? Again, beyond the plumbing and the DNA, to recognize that manhood, real manhood through the eyes of God, is about character. Okay? It's about character. It's not your bicep. It's not your truck. It's not your gun. It's your character that defines who is a real man and who is not. And that masculine character is under assault in the day that we live in. And there is this massive attempt to redefine gender and redefine maleness and femaleness and to get away from what God looked at with Adam and Eve and said, this is very, very good. And the church is called, like a kind of embassy in a society that is increasingly effeminate, to be a kind of lighthouse of what real masculinity looks like. Now, in order for that to be true, it's not what's preached from the pulpit as much as what is lived out by the congregation and the men of the congregation, and I'm one of them. This is true for me as well. But this requires that we understand what that's supposed to look like biblically. Okay, so I just threw out a definition. I can say, be warmed and filled, on your way, go be men now. And yet it'd be like, how do I do that? What does that really look like? Can you please talk about that? And indeed, I'm going to. And as I do, I want to emphasize, this is not an exhaustive list. But you'll notice a little theme, okay? These are all M&Ms, okay? M&Ms. We start with a man and his mission. Men, what is the goal of your life? What are you really trying to accomplish to be? Having the right mission plays a huge role in being the man that God would have us to be. Now, why do I say that? Many reasons, but one is, if you think about who is the greatest man who ever lived, we'd say Jesus. Did you know that Jesus said about one man, he is the greatest man ever born of a woman? And his name was John the Baptist. And John the Baptist had his mission figured out. He knew why he existed. And this is what John the Baptist said regarding his life and Jesus. He must increase, I must decrease. He must increase, I must decrease. John the Baptist knew, and he had a unique calling for sure. He was the prophet who paved the way for the Messiah. He understood my role is to shine as much light as I possibly can on Jesus, okay? He had that nailed down. He had that figured out. It's exactly what the angel said was his purpose. He was a light, and he was radical about it. I mean, John the Baptist, this guy lived off the grid. He ate off the land. He cared little about fashionable dress or appearance. He didn't bathe. Now, to be clear, men, we highly recommend bathing. But why did Jesus say John the Baptist was the greatest man? In part, it was because John the Baptist knew his purpose and knew his mission, and he lived it out in a radical way. He pointed people to Jesus. Here at Bethel, we would say this: John the Baptist was all about him. He was all about him. He must increase, I must decrease. And John the Baptist was so radical in the day that he lived in, people came from the cities just to hear him and to see him. And to live that kind of mission out is as radical today as it was for him. To be all about him. The mission for a man is to devote our lives to make disciples of Jesus. And in the day-to-day of life, we do this largely by living out the gospel in our marriage and living out the gospel in our vocation and living out the gospel in our recreation and living out the gospel in our masculinity. What is the purpose of my masculinity, that strength of character, that bravery? What is the purpose? It is not that I might increase and everybody else decrease. It is that I might decrease and Christ might increase. And a masculine man who is mature in his walk with Jesus has that ultimate mission in his life. Men, how you doing with that? What's your big deal? It seems to me there are so many men living aimless lives, purposeless lives. Now, if you talk to them, you say, hey, what are you doing? Everybody's got something that's their thing. This is my thing, this is my thing. But when you look at the thing that is their thing, oftentimes it's silly things. It's their passion, but their passion isn't anything that in 1,000 years means anything at all. And God has called Christian men to be on mission and to take that masculine strength and all that creativity and that energy and that leadership and to pour ourselves into the making of disciples, first in my family, in my home, through the church and the community, and to display the glory of Jesus in every aspect of my life. And here's the thing about being a Christian man is that our big thing, our mission flows in the stream of our passion if we're a Christian. Do you remember what Jesus came to Peter after his resurrection and he said, do you love me? Peter said, Lord, you know I love you. Jesus said, do you love me? Peter says, you know I love you. And in a way, Jesus comes to the man every day and says, do you love me? Really? And when we love Jesus, now the opportunity to take that strength of character that masculinity provides and to flow in the passion that is mine if I'm a Christian, you see how these channels come together. The man who says he loves Jesus, but his real passion is some of these other things, is living a kind of disjointed masculinity.
That was Pastor Steve DeWitt reminding us that biblical masculinity begins with understanding that being a man is about more than biology. It's about character, mission, and alignment with God's will. You're listening to The Journey, and today's message is titled, What is a Man? To replay this message, visit thejourney.fm or grab your smart device and subscribe to The Journey podcast. Well, here at The Journey, we want to help you experience the deep truths of God's Word amidst life's daily busyness this new year and beyond. So this month, we want to share a resource that addresses one of the most vital areas of Christian living. It's titled Rethinking Sexuality, God's Design and Why It Matters. It's written by Dr. Julie Slattery. This book is groundbreaking and helps us understand sexuality within the broader context of God's redemptive plan. But more than just addressing cultural issues, this book will equip you with a biblical framework for understanding and responding to the sexual challenges facing people in our community and perhaps even in your family. Through Dr. Slattery's wisdom and compassionate approach, you'll be invited to move beyond simply confronting the problem to confidently sharing Christ's love and grace with those who are hurting. We're offering Rethinking Sexuality as our gift when you give to support The Journey. Your generous gift helps us continue sharing God's truth with listeners everywhere. As we begin 2025, we want to invite you to join us in this vital ministry. To receive your copy, just call 844-7-JOURNEY. That's 844-756-8763. Or you can give online at thejourney.fm. And if you want to make Bethel Church part of your spiritual journey, then join us for worship services at any of our locations in Crown Point, Indiana, and surrounding campuses. Find service times and directions at bethelweb.org. I'm Tim Svoboda, inviting you to join us tomorrow when Pastor Steve concludes his message titled, What is a Man? Find out why God calls men to lead with tender-hearted strength and Christ-like courage in every aspect of life. Thursday on The Journey. Today's program was produced and furnished by Bethel Church in Crown Point, Indiana.